So we're going to be talking in this panel discussion about during the Metaverse Congress about the benefits and risks from the ESG perspective. So, I've been involved with the last couple of years along with one of my co-panelists today on the IEEE Global Initiative on the Ethics of Extended Reality, where we produced 8 different white papers. And I wanted to just sort of call those out, and then we'll sort of dig into each of the range of different topics here. But just to look at anytime we're looking at the ethics and how to do tech policy, you have different dynamics of the cultural norms, the law, the market dynamics, and the technological architecture in the code. So some issues you'll be able to solve with technology, other things may be solved by the market, other things may have laws, and some things you need to still have the cultural norms. And as I think about the metaverse, I think of it as this mereologically nested set of contexts. It starts with the earth, the culture, and then within the context of the culture is the laws, economy, the design guidelines. So roughly you can see the top things here are XR layers, and then down here with the network and this sort of broader context is the metaverse as it starts to kind of expand the internet from 2D to 3D. I've talked in other talks about sort of the ethical and moral dilemmas and starting to map out the different contexts, everything from medicine and education, AWE, and then I did a XR Ethics Manifesto where I tried to sort of map out all the many different ethical and moral dilemmas. And from this manifesto, then we started to then do this effort with the IEEE, where we called out and did a number of different white papers. We got a bunch of different participants, and then we produced, at this point, 8 different white papers, everything from metaverse governance to diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, virtual clones and identity, business finance and economics, education, the erosion of anonymity and privacy, medicine, and then social spaces, trolling, harassment, and online safety. And then I did a whole podcast series on each of these white papers, kind of digging into them. So over the course of the discussion today, we'll be kind of hitting on a variety of these. But from there, I'd love to pass it over to my other panelists to kind of like introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into the discussion. Let's start with Monique, since you were involved with me on this whole effort.
Thank you, Kent. Yes, indeed, as a co-chair of ethics and extended reality, and going back many years in this space, and the papers and the corpus of work has been fantastic, and your participation and contribution. It should be stated that Dr. Yu Yuan is a great sponsor of our work at IEEE. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm also president and co-founder of the Humanized Internet. This is a Swiss-based nonprofit, and with it, dealing with mainly ethics and technology. And so something that is very, very close and dear to my heart. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. One other aspect is that I am involved in the World Economic Forum, and so have been dealing with digital justice and also with the emerging discussion on DAOs. So looking forward once again. Thank you.
Awesome. And maybe we'll, oops, I pinned Ben, but maybe Ben, maybe you can turn on your camera and go ahead and introduce yourself. Oh, we can't hear you, Ben. I don't know if you have to unmute.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Erwin. I'm the creator of the Polys WebXR Awards and WebXR Summit Series. And last year, I got together with a bunch of folks, including Terry Schussler of Deutsche Telekom, Neil Trevitt of the Kronos Group, and Ivo Haining of the Open Metaverse Interoperability Group. And we formed a group called the MetaTr Versal. And Daniel Dabosky Bryant and Julie Smithson joined us, and we had a series of events, including 3 Zoom calls where we heard from the community of people about standards and interoperability. And then we had an event in March, which was more of a panel session, and we also did a play about the metaverse starring Sophia Mashasha at the AWE conference in June. And so I'm very pleased to be here to talk about standards and interoperability and the importance of them in the metaverse.
My name is Steve Mann, and I'm co-inventor of XR together with Charles Wyckoff in 1991, I guess, when we sort of formalized that idea of what XR, extended reality, X-reality, whatever it is. And also, I've been living in the metaverse, I guess, since my childhood in the 1960s and 1970s, even though it wasn't called that then. And I guess I'm interested also in the sort of accessibility issues of the metaverse and making sure that it remains accessible to everybody and isn't too much like with proprietarism or whatever might derail its accessibility.
Yeah, I'd like to go ahead and jump in on this, Kent, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, as it is a conversation, I can't stress enough the importance of XR and accessibility. In fact, one of the papers published has been on accessibility, and it was published by Dylan Fox. And it is really important because we stress so much an ableist society, which really is, excludes people who are individuals who are visually impaired or hearing impaired and so on. And this is why one of the paper that was published by Dylan, and by the way, had participated in a VR accessibility conference a couple of weeks ago, was extraordinarily important. Because if you're not in that world, living in that world, you can't walk in the shoes of other folks. You don't have, for example, we don't have captions here. I think that's the point that we heard earlier from Steve. We don't have other, other areas other technologies that allow for folks in this world to participate. So we have stressed, the point I want to make here is we have stressed accessibility in our corpus of work, and as one of the largest priorities that's been published. So that's one point I want to make. Thank you.
Yeah, the interview or the paper that was by both Dylan Fox and Isabel Gannett Thornton. I'll post a link to my interview that I did with them, and you can check out the white paper and that discussion. Really critically important. And before we move on to accessibility, I'd love to hear maybe some more of your thoughts, Steve, in terms of because you've been involved in this space, wearable computing, for a long, long time. So I'd love to hear, any of your specific insights. There's things that are happening with XR Access and the XRA. They have a whole GitHub. They have a repository for trying to create with design user patterns for people to refer to that are linked there. But Steve, I'd love to hear some of your reflections on this as an issue and where you see is either some resources or what are the biggest challenges yet to be figured out in terms of making this new immersive technology as accessible as we possibly can.
Yeah, I think what I'd say is that the early comers into this universe, the people who've come into wearables and XR and Metaverse early on, are very highly represented in people who think differently or function differently. There's a lot of people with ADHD, autism spectrum, various, I know a lot of visually impaired and hearing impaired people who've joined this world because body modification starts off a lot from these sorts of needs. And so all these kinds of technologies a lot of times have originated from these needs. And so if you look at the people who've really entered the space early in this context, a lot of what happens is self-created technology. And so it's really important to keep it open, to have open standards. So for example, like Jitsi is an open video conferencing standard upon which you can put standards-based interaction and build technologies that you can build a piece of hardware that'll do a Jitsi video conference, for example, for somebody who might have a need for that. So all of these things, the more interoperable and open they are, the easier they are. The problem is they get overly integrated. And we see that with computing, like over there, I still have my Apple II computer that I got in 1978, and it still works. It still boots almost instantly, and it still responds faster than any other computer that you'd see today. And it's very extensible and interoperable and reliable, and it came with schematic diagrams and source code listings and everything. So it was really a nice computer. But then what we saw is companies like Apple eventually migrating towards a very closed kind of system that doesn't play well with other players. And on the other hand, there's other companies that came in and filled that void of making things interoperable and open, just simple standards that come into play in terms of being green to the earth, being friendly to the earth. like the fact that you can replace and repair, right to repair. I kind of extend the right to repair to also the right to understand. Like, there are some people who think differently than others, and they have a right to understand. There are also even people who sort of need to understand things in order to be able to use them. In this sense, I could almost regard intelligence as one form of disability, because certain people who are creators and makers kind of grew up understanding things and developing kind of a need to understand things in order to be able to use them. And I know a lot of people who can't use modern technologies because they don't understand them. Like, I know a friend of mine, he makes his own cars, e-cars, electric vehicles, using discrete transistors for all the three-phase controllers, and he built his own electric car from scratch, all at the transistor level. But he can't use modern technologies, like he can't figure out how to use a cell phone, and yet he's absolutely brilliant. He understands Maxwell's equations, he understands quantum physics really, really well. And so I think a lot of these technologies, they exclude intelligent people because they're designed to be easy to use, so easy to use, in fact, that they don't, not only do they not require intelligence, but they actually kind of punish you if you're intelligent. If you think intelligently, they exclude you from being able to use them. So there has to be a mandate of accessibility, kind of an understandability access that enables people who need to understand things to be able to use them.
Definitely. And Ben, I'd love to turn it over to you. You had mentioned some of the different efforts that you have going on. There was the IEEE XR ethics, or the IEEE Global Initiative on the Ethics of Extended Reality, the white paper that was on metaverse governance. And I think that part of either the governance or at least the standards for interoperability, there's a lot of efforts that are happening already in terms of the Metaverse Standards Forum and some of the different metaversal conversations you've been having. So I'd love to maybe pass it over to you to talk about what your kind of assessment for the ESG perspective in terms of standards, but also the efforts that are already happening, maybe just to give people a little bit more context in terms of your role and what you see as what's already existing and what can be done in terms of what may come from the IEEE and how they might be able to either get involved with what's already happening, or to take some of those different discussions and then start to maybe formalize them into standards. But love to hear some of your thoughts on this kind of the current state and the state of the union of interoperability.
Yes, thank you. And you were part of the first MetaTr event, and one of the common threads and one of the things that you spoke to, Kent, was the humanity. Like, you spoke about human rights as something that needs to be sort of baked into the standards of the metaverse. And there were a lot of different dimensions, technical, but I think that one of the things that people are talking a lot about is protecting our humanity within this. And so the context of this particular conversation being the environmental, social, and governance aspects of this, and the benefits and risks there. There are a lot of different breakdowns to that. And to your question about the sort of state of the union when it comes to this, I think one of the things that I see with particularly the Metaverse Standards Forum, I really admire what Neil Trevett has done to bring together, first of all, there were 35 founding stakeholders, which were a lot of the big companies. And this was one of the things that we really wanted to see happen, was that the companies that are really leading the build of the metaverse, it's a big effort with a lot of different stakeholders to it, but he managed to get a lot of the bigger companies, but then open it up. And from what I understand, there's something like 500 different organizations. There are principals and there are participants, and I encourage people to get involved with that. And all of the different groups, such as the Open Metaverse Interoperability Group that helped sort of spearhead that with the W3C, to do the standards for the web, and the web, speaks a lot to the accessibility, not only in terms of access, meeting people where they are, but in terms of making it so that the differently abled can actually access and use the technology. And I think that one of the most important aspects of it when it comes to risks is that we haven't really solved the original digital divide, which is that not, the pandemic really exposed, in particular in underserved communities where kids didn't have broadband, and you had kids that couldn't go to school and they didn't have broadband at home, and they were sitting outside of Starbucks trying to get Wi-Fi, trying to go to school on an iPad. So we haven't solved the connectivity problem yet, let alone this coming new metaverse where you're going to need expensive and sophisticated hardware. And so I think that one of the key risks and things that we need to address from an action perspective is equitable access.
Right. Yeah. And there's, as we go and have a half-hour conversation about this, I mean, there's so many different topics. The 8 white papers was an 11-hour series I did on my podcast. And Monique, I'd love to hear some of your reflections after working on this effort for the last 2 years and reading all the papers and listening to all the conversations around it. And what are the things that you want to maybe kind of highlight or point out in terms of this discussion that we're having right now?
Well, I would just like to break it down. I mean, in terms of what the topic is, right? It's ESG. So, looking at it from what is environmental and what is social and what is governance from the perspective. Definitely, there was a corpus of work involved here. And by the way, we worked with Dr. Mann even before then. So, as you know, Steve, we worked on this before. So together we have a history. Well, if we're looking at the environmental, I mean, listening to Rav and what's happening in NVIDIA, and if we look at it, there's going to be a lot of data. And so you have to think about what does that mean for the cloud? What does it mean for what does it mean for green compute from that perspective within the metaverse environment? So that's something that we have to think about, especially in this time that we have a concern around our environment. In social, I cannot stress more than social means really it's got to be. We have to think about it from an inclusive perspective. We've brought this up before, especially with accessibility. As number one, we tend to talk about, I think in the industry, there's sense, and especially for those who are going to build these platforms, right? As Ben has articulated earlier, there has to be, a mindset that accessibility has to be forefront here. It has to be built accordingly. And the last but not least, something that I care about deeply is governance. And governance, we're talking about standards, but if we listen to Ava Kiley, you have to move from standards to policy. And so this is going to be issues around safety. This is going to be issues around privacy as data is collected and collected in these digital worlds. What does that mean? I mean, you can determine somebody's sexuality by gaze, technology, and also how data is collected. What is and whether or not what we're talking about in terms of safety overall. So that's going to have, if you think about a crime being committed, as we know crime, if somebody is actually bullied and within a metaverse world, what does that mean? What is the recourse to justice? And I think that we're going to think about metaverse law and policy perhaps in the future. I mean, there are cases where you have gang rape occurring in the metaverse world, and then what happens? It's being egged on, and what happens as in terms of recourse for justice. So these are the concerns I'm going to be looking forward to. Participating in these conversations, as has been indicated in the very beginning of this Congress, we're at the tip of this discussion. So again, those are my thoughts in terms of ESG and the metaverse itself.
Okay, yeah, and we probably have time for one more comment from both Steve and Ben, and we'll just have to wrap up and move on just for the sake of time. But I'd love to hear some final thoughts from you, Steve, in terms of, you talked about surveillance and surveillance. Privacy seems to be, for me at least, a pretty huge issue as we move forward. Neuro rights and different dimensions around if there needs to be more protections. Yeah, other things that maybe come, either that or other topics that come up when you think about the environmental, social, and the governance aspects of the metaverse.
Yeah, I think, I mean, privacy is really an important thing. And one of the things is we wrote an interesting paper entitled Privacy is Surveillance. Privacy is just another form of surveillance, because privacy, as frequently defined nowadays, means that you've got privacy settings so that you can block other people from, block your neighbors from seeing something, but the authorities still can see what you're doing. So the meaning of privacy has to be carefully defined if we're going to use the word. If privacy is just another form of surveillance, then we really don't want it. On the other hand, there's a different kind of privacy, maybe the older, more traditional notion of privacy as kind of the ability to interact and engage with people in a way that no one else other than the two parties who are interacting, or two or more parties, can get access to that. So that's a question of whether true privacy is suppressed or modern privacy, I'll call it, which means that you can adjust the settings on something, but like modern anonymity, like on Facebook, you can select anonymous, but maybe somebody inside the company can still spy on you or whatever. So we got to be really careful what we mean by privacy and not use the word until we define it. So I kind of don't like using the word privacy in unless we define. So I talk about privalence, privacy and sensing, privacy surveillance, surveillance. And the other thing is the free open source and standards notion of the metaverse. What we really need is to get together and define accessibility standards for the metaverse, but also rolled into that, we could define like access standards and so on that define individual, how can people interact in the metaverse and keep their information out of the hands of the organizers, or just to use the term roughly, the bigs, I guess, is the kind of idea, like large entities from, like, how do you protect the interest of these smaller entities like individuals from the bigs is really the fundamental question, because the bigs will often collude together to disadvantage the individual small entities. So I know it's a very broad, almost childish sort of understanding of the world, but the surveillance model is very simple, I think. And if we can hit home on that, then I think we can ask some of the bigger questions.
And Ben, I'd love to hear any final thoughts from you in terms of environment, social, and governance, metaverse. You're muted. Ben.
Just to chime in on where Steve ended in terms of surveillance and surveillance, I think that one of the most important use cases that really hasn't been delved into for the metaverse is civics. And I think that having this spatial commons where we can come together and communicate and help with the governance process is something that we need to pay a little bit more attention to. But I think that, to wrap up on the governance issue, one of the main things that we can do and should do is to learn from the lessons of the previous iterations of the web, particularly Web 2.0, where we've talked a lot about privacy and surveillance and so forth, and the way that advertising is used. We need to build a new business model around this so that the metaverse can be a profitable place for the people that are investing in it, but without us having to sell ourselves out to do that. And laissez-faire data policies isn't really something that's going to serve our humanity very well going forward. So we need to figure that out. I think that that's very important. And also when it comes to standards, is that we need to strike the balance of accelerated growth where we need to have standards so that we can, my lens on this is as a developer. I've been a developer for 25 years, and a lot of my pain in my career had to do with trying to keep up with browsers that were not incompatible. And I don't want to see the next generation of developers have to suffer that. And I certainly don't want to see, and we can't have a situation where an entire section of the history of the content of the web is wiped out as it was with Flash. I was a Flash developer, and Flash is dead. You can't load a Flash site anymore, and untold amounts of investment was made in Flash, and that is essentially history that's been erased. So we need to future-proof And lastly, I think that when it comes to governance, we need to have qualified regulators. We need to have people who really understand it. One of the things that really confounded me was when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying before Congress, and the regulators absolutely positively, they didn't know the difference between iOS and Android. And so, the complexity and the sophistication of really understanding the metaverse, the people who make the rules really need to get it. And so this is something, there needs to be an education process in place so that regulators can do it. And we have to balance between not being heavy-handed about regulation so that we can have innovation. We need to have standards so that we can future-proof our content. And we need to have accountability mechanisms so that we don't have a situation where one player can have an undue influence on things and sort of set the whole ecosystem out of balance. And that's really what I want to see happen, is a healthy ecosystem, because at the end of the day, our humanity is in the balance here.
Awesome. Well, Ben, Monique, and Steve, thanks so much for having a little tour around the environmental, social, and governance issues of the metaverse.